Smith-Njigba, the Seahawks had one of the best receiving cores in the NFL. What does the presence of the first-round pick out of Ohio State do to take this group to another level? We're going to be breaking down in our latest training camp preview here on Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, who today is Rob on the road. As you may notice, our viewers on YouTube, that he's out chilling, doing some vacationing here for the 4th of July holiday. We will not have a show tomorrow, a very rare day off here at Locked On Seahawks, but we're going to enjoy some time with our families. That being said, we've got a fun Monday show before we get to the holiday here. We're going to be breaking down the receiver group in our latest training camp preview. We'll be tackling your mailbag questions for our Monday mailbag, and we'll continue our 90-man countdown with numbers 35 through 31. This episode is brought your way by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Now, for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Even before Jaxon Smith-Njigba was selected with the 20th pick in April's draft, the Seahawks had one of the best receiving cores in the NFL because of the presence of DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, one of the best 1-2 punches on the outside in the entire league. But this team has been looking for that number 3 option. They drafted D. Eskridge a few years ago. That to this point has not worked out. They haven't really had that number 3 receiver that can take this group to the next level. And they're hoping that Smith-Njigba is going to be able to do that. And heading into training camp, Rob, there's a lot of questions that we can ask at various position groups, but I think when you look at this receiver group, the only question that really needs to be asked going into this season is, what does the ceiling look like for this receiver group with Jaxon Smith-Njigba being added to a team that already has DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett? They're hoping a more effective D. Eskridge and a number of other talented players of that position group. You muted yourself, Rob.
Sorry about that, guys. As Corbin said, this is the very first show on the road here, and so there's going to be some technical difficulties, but hopefully that will not be the case any longer. I think that you articulated very well, Corbin. I mean, as we break down all these different positional groups of the Seahawks, obviously there's going to be one critical question for basically every single position. But for the Seahawks wide receiver core, there's just so much talent. There's so much proven production already, of course, with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, the first 2 wide receivers in the same season to both go over 1,000 yards for the Seahawks. And yet it still feels like there is yet a huge untapped potential there. As you said, we've been kind of waiting to see a third receiver kind of come out of the woodwork. I think at minimum, you're expecting Jaxon Smith-Njigba to at least be able, or maybe it's D. Eskridge, but somebody at least be able to duplicate the production lost by Marquise Goodwin, who finished a year ago tied for third with the most touchdowns with 4, tied for 5th with the most targets among all the Seahawks, behind the top 2 wide receivers, of course, Metcalf and Lockett, as well as Seattle's top 2 receiving tight ends in Noah Fant and Will Dissly. To me, that's the absolute floor, is they're going to be at least as good as last year. And I think that there is an argument that you could make that this is going to be the best Seattle wide receiver core in franchise history, and arguably the best wide receiver core in all of the NFL. And so that's why I do think that the Seahawks in their passing offense, the moon basically is the ceiling here. I mean, I think the Seahawks wide receiver core is so gifted that it really could take off, because again, as good as DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are, the reality is they only combined for 15 touchdowns a year ago. That's less than some of the other superstar wide receivers out there. And I think you can make an argument that the biggest play that DK Metcalf has made to this date still is stopping a touchdown rather than scoring a touchdown when he ran down Buda Baker a couple of years ago. At least that's one that's still an iconic one that people are going to remember. So it does feel like, as good as Seattle's wide receivers have been to this point, it still feels like there's an awful long ways they could go to become even more formidable.
I've always looked at it as this way, and Marquise Goodwin was able to mitigate this a little bit during the middle of the season last year when they had another guy that could really fly downfield and grab the attention of opposing defensive coordinators. But they just haven't had that player that is that middle of the field maestro. They haven't had that guy, at least since Doug Baldwin retired. Baldwin was very good at doing that. He had a lot of other things that he did outside the hashes as well, but they have not had that number 3 receiver that can really attack between the hash marks and can win contested catches consistently, be a chain mover consistently. And Jaxon Smith-Njigba is going to check off those boxes. And I still believe that D. Eskridge, if he's healthy, I view this kind of like the Rashad Penny situation. We have not really gotten a chance to see what Eskridge can do because when he has been healthy, he's just been trying to work into the rotation and then he gets hurt again. And so if you could just have a clean bill of health, he's really the wild card to me in this receiving core because we're still talking about a guy that ran in the 4.3s at his pro day, and you can see that speed. He led the country in all-around yards per game his last season at Western Michigan. So this guy has been a prolific playmaker, but he has not been able to stay on the field. And I'm just looking at this situation with Smith-Njigba now being on the roster that the pressure is now completely off Eskridge, unless you're going to say there's pressure to make the team, which I suppose you could say that is there right now with Smith-Njigba coming to town. But he doesn't have that weight that we're looking for you to be the number 3 receiver to go with Metcalf and Lockett. That pressure is off his shoulders now. Just go out, be healthy, and be a playmaker, and he could still be a guy that is really effective in this offense. And imagine if he's able to do that, you suddenly have a quartet of receivers that opponents have to deal with. Oh, by the way, Derek Young is still a player to keep an eye on as well because he started to show up late last year, and he's got something that Eskridge and Smith-Njigba do not have, and that is great size that is going to help him break tackles, play on the outside. And so they just got a lot of different playmaking options here, Rob, that really makes this a fascinating group. And as Nick and I both argued on Friday, it is the most talented group on Seattle's offensive side of the football, which is saying something because there's some other really talented position groups on this offense.
Yeah, but nothing like the wide receiver core. And so I 100% agree with that assertion from both of you. And I love that you mentioned Derek Young when it comes to the wild cards. I mean, I certainly have high expectations for D. Eskridge. I kind of scoff when I hear Seahawks fans out there who, just are so critical of D. Eskridge. And obviously he's not been productive. I mean, he only has 1 touchdown to this point in his career. That has been a disappointment to the Seahawks and to D. Eskridge. But if D. Eskridge were suddenly just to be released by Seattle, there would be 31 other NFL franchises out there who would just fall over themselves to put in a bid for a guy that has his combination of speed and make you miss kind of potential. I mean, again, he struggled with injuries. You made the kind of allusion to Rashad Penny. Again, a big time playmaker. Obviously has struggled with durability, but there's a reason why the NFC champion Philadelphia Eagles are the ones that side Rashad Penny, because they know that he has that type of immediate big play potential, and D. Eskridge has that as well. So again, I think that, to me, one of the most exciting things about this wide receiver core for the Seahawks is you have the sure things. At least it feels like the sure things. We've been lulled into the sense of security that Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf are sure things because they've just been so darn durable, so darn productive. But you also have that element of, what could Jaxon Smith-Njigba be? What could a healthy D. Eskridge be? And again, with Derek Young, with Cade Johnson, I mean, Jake Bobo, if you want to get down into the depth chart, I mean, there are some talented players here. And as I talked about before, to me, the best receiving cores in all the NFL, Corbin, are the ones where you can kind of mix and match. I've used the Baskin-Robbins pick your own flavor so many times, but I really think that's critical in today's NFL. Every NFL team out there has some really talented talented corners, some really talented safeties, but they all also have some type of deficiencies. If you've got the really talented receiver core that's very versatile, then you can mix and match, especially when you have a quarterback as talented and as accurate as Geno Smith.
And I'm glad you mentioned a couple of the undrafted guys, because Jake Bobo, Matt Landers, I mean, you're talking about a guy that's 6'4",
Landers,
that ran in the 4.3s and averaged over 20 yards per reception the last couple of years in college. Now, he is a one-trick pony, but he is extremely good at that one trick. And if you're scoring 40, 50-yard touchdowns downfield, that's a pretty good trick to have in your bag. And so there are some guys here that, I think Landers and Bobo would probably have a really good chance to make a number of teams in the NFL. I don't know if they can make this team, though, with all the depth the Seahawks have. And Cade Johnson's another one that I'm glad you mentioned, because Geno Smith showed one thing that I think is critical for bottom of the roster receivers. He showed great trust in Cade Johnson in that season finale last year against the Rams. He even completed a couple passes to him in the playoff game against the 49ers. He wouldn't be throwing the ball to Cade Johnson if he didn't have that trust and that chemistry. And so I think he's a guy that's kind of been forgotten with all these newcomers, the undrafted guys, that you should still keep an eye on, especially if he can return kicks and punch, which he did in the college level. That's another area that D. Eskridge could shine. So with this much depth, with this much talent, you're going to have to be able to contribute in the special teams to make this football team. But they got a lot of different size, a lot of different athletic traits, a lot of different play styles in this group to go with the star power at the top. And it's going to make it a really fun position group to watch, maybe battling for one or two roster spots that are available there in training camp and the preseason. Coming up next, we're going to get to your Monday mailbag questions. Tons of questions off Twitter as well as YouTube. We'll get to those here in a moment. Our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks, which is brought your way by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. When I was a site manager, LinkedIn Jobs was my go-to to post writing positions to land top candidates, and they made the process easy and seamless. All you have to do is create your job post and then add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the best candidates, the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined. He's on the road, but he's here for the show. My co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening down in Malibu, California, or across the country in Dover, Delaware. We greatly appreciate all the 12s who make Locked On Seahawks their first listen 5 days a week. For everydayers, we're not going to have our normal Tuesday show because of the 4th of July holiday, but coming up on Wednesday, we're going to get to way back Wednesday, and we're going to be diving into our all underrated team, and we'll be checking out the linebacker position as well as receivers, some really fun players that we'll be talking about as we continue to build our all underrated squads. You won't want to miss it coming out of the holiday. Let's get to your questions here at our Monday mailbag. And our first one, Rob, you and I are going to have a lot of fun with this one. Coming from Jeremy on YouTube, which non-NFL pro athlete would you have paid the most money to watch play for the Seahawks, and why?
The two athletes that immediately jump to my mind are just great, iconic athletes, and that being Babe Ruth and Muhammad Ali. If I'm going to be paying money to watch an athlete, then I want to see the greatest of all time. I actually feel like in some ways we're watching one of the greats of all time in Shohei Ohtani and what he's doing with the Angels. But if I'm going to go way back, then certainly the Babe and Muhammad Ali would be two people that I definitely would have loved to have been able to see in person.
I think Muhammad Ali would have been a really fun pass rusher in the NFL.
Yeah.
I think that he would have been great at that position. As for Babe Ruth, it's tough to tell because he was a big guy for his time, but who knows now what he would have been playing. But he had kind of that nasty edge. Maybe he ends up being an offensive or defensive lineman. It's easy to point to LeBron James on this one because Pete Carroll tried to recruit him when the NBA had that lockout years ago. The Seahawks had a jersey with James' name on it. And certainly LeBron James would have been fun catching passes from Russell Wilson. That would have been exciting. But I'm actually going to go with a guy that's playing in the majors today who was an extremely good high school football player, and that was Aaron Judge. And I hate saying it because I'm a Blue Jays fan, and so I despise the Yankees, but I have great respect for Judge with the numbers he's put up, the way that he plays the game. And I've actually seen high school football highlights from him. He had a bunch of D1 offers, and rightfully so. This guy was a monster. And if you've seen him on a baseball field, you know he is a big human being. He would have been fun, maybe him coming in as Geno Smith's competition at quarterback because he could throw the ball a country mile, and he's an athlete that can run around too. So Aaron Judge, I think, would be a lot of fun if we're talking modern players. And I agree with you, Muhammad Ali. I just would have liked to see him on a football field chasing after quarterbacks with the tenacity that he boxed with. I think he would have been pretty fun to watch on the gridiron. Next question here, and this one specifically for Rob. From Pat ACC on Twitter, the DB room is crowded with talent. Any thoughts on trade possibilities? Say Mike Jackson, showcase him in the preseason and get a high day 2 pick.
Yeah, I think high day 2 is going to be pretty rich, but at the same time, I absolutely believe that that Seattle's cornerback room is one of the deepest in all of the NFL, and there's going to be some teams out there who are going to come calling. We have had back-to-back really good, strong crops in the college market. So there's going to be a lot of clubs out there who have very young cornerback rooms. Kansas City Chiefs are one, for example. They have a very young cornerback room. They had two University of Washington and Washington State guys, Jalen Watson and I'm spacing on the other one. But the kid from UW, Trent McDuffie. Anyways, that's an example of a club that is playing to win right now, of course, as the defending Super Bowl champions, that has a lot of youth back there. And I do think that there is going to be a market for Seattle to try to possibly peddle away one of these veteran corners should they want to. But at the same time, I just think that Seattle views themselves as a possible Super Bowl contender. And I think that this is going to be one of the commodities, that cornerback depth that John Schneider is going to rightly prioritize and keep. So I don't expect the Seahawks to be making any moves. I do think that Mike Jackson is going to get plenty of playing time because I think he's earned it. And Devin Witherspoon is going to have to kind of fight his way back. Tariq Woolen, he's going to have to work his way back from the surgery just to get that spot on the field back away from Mike Jackson.
Next question here coming from Greg Bentz on Twitter. If Anthony Richardson was available, would the Seahawks have taken him at number 5? And so, Rob, you and I both have interesting perspective on this. And obviously we can't indicate who we have talked to behind the scenes. But I know during draft weekend that I asked a number of people about that possibility. And I got pretty coy responses, as you would expect. Nobody's going to outright tell you, oh, yeah, if he was there, we were going to take him. But reading through the tea leaves, at least this was my perspective, and maybe you have a little different perspective on this, but based on the people that I talked to, it doesn't sound to me necessarily like that is the direction that the Seahawks were planning on going anyway. And I kind of got the viewpoint that all along Witherspoon was the guy that they really wanted, and that they would have taken him even if Richardson was the guy that was still there at number 5. That's at least the way that I've viewed it from the responses that I've gotten. Again, that might just be some scout speak or whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't seem like that is something the Seahawks were actually going to do, which kind of surprised me.
Yeah, I definitely bought into the idea that Seattle was going to go with Anthony Richardson. I had him going in my final mock draft. I've talked to enough people in Seattle's organization that I feel very confidently if he had been available at number 20, then he would have been very much in the mix. I don't know that he would have been their pick at number 5. I flat out asked that exact question to a couple of different guys, the Seahawks, and they kind of give you that wry grin. But at the same time, I think that they absolutely believe in Devin Witherspoon. They believe in Geno Smith, and I think that they saw the risk factor that Anthony Richardson was. Again, maybe at 20, but not at 5. It was basically the party line that I heard. Kind of, on and off air, so to speak, whether I had people around me or just in brief conversations since then. I do believe that they were very intrigued by him, but I think that they basically feel like they had a little slice of heaven just fall on their lap in Geno Smith. And again, I think that they feel like they can compete right now. And so why not do that? And so that's why I believe that they took the strategy they did. But I 100% believe that there was absolutely interest in Anthony Richardson.
I think if they would have traded down, like if Witherspoon got taken earlier, I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios where Richardson could have potentially been the guy. But based on what I have been told before the draft, during the draft, after, it seems like that was not one of their first targets really at that spot at number 5. Next question from Blueberry Chuck says there were recently some Shelby Harris back to Seattle rumblings. Smoke or fire? So I'll say this. I think right now that it's just smoldering. Let's just use that word. I think that as long as Shelby Harris doesn't have a team, that there is a chance that the Seahawks could try to make something happen to open up enough cash that they can sign him. Because I think John Schneider and Pete Carroll know that if there's one area on this football team going into this year that they still could put reinforcements out there or need reinforcements, it is that defensive line that's got so many new faces and you got a lot of young guys there. So I think as long as Shelby Harris is on the market and hasn't signed with somebody, it's a possibility. And I would not be surprised at all if early in training camp that they ended up bringing him back. But there's some things they're going to have to do behind the scenes to open up some cap space in order to be able to make such a signing. So we'll have to wait and see. That's really where we're at right now. I know fans are wanting there to be fire there, and maybe there will be, but right now I think it's just smoldering and it's just a possibility. We'll just leave it at that. Next question here for Rob, Little Billy on YouTube. How many 40-plus yard receptions do you think Jaxon Smith-Njigba will have this year, and how many deep ball targets will he be stealing away from DK and Tyler? That's certainly an interesting question because even though this isn't known as his game, Rob, he does win downfield, I think, more than people realize.
He does. He obviously had a heck of a quarterback throwing him the ball at Ohio State in a very aggressive offense. I do not expect there to be a large number of 40-plus yard plays for Jaxon Smith-Njigba, at least not as a rookie for the Seahawks. Maybe one, maybe two. I think that the bigger plays in terms of yards per reception, yards per score, I think that's going to remain in the DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett extent as well. Both of those are very highly targeted receivers in the short to intermediate zone, in the red zone. That to me is where I think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is going to make his hay, is as a third down guy, as a red zone target, but not necessarily as that big deep play kind of a guy. I don't think that he's Marquise Goodwin. I think the closer comparison here is D. Eskridge, as we talked about before. To me, that is the guy who I think is going to carve into possibly Metcalf and Lockett and Jaxon Smith-Njigba's big play touchdowns is going to be D. Eskridge. He is the one who I think is going to have the most or the highest average in terms of big plays for the Seahawks in 2023.
And our last question here coming from Taylor Brand on YouTube. What position on offense, defense do you believe needs to be addressed for the Seahawks to be closer to Super Bowl contention? Are there free agents or players on the trading block that they should look into to fill these spots? So the obvious answer here, and Rob's going to be shaking his head yes on this one, we just talked about it, is defensive tackle. That is still the position that stands out to me where I'm just wondering, have they done enough to truly be a contender? And then on the offensive side of the football, I actually, I'm not going to say that I'm the only person that has said this. I actually saw somebody else that tweeted this a few days ago, but I actually would like to see the Seahawks add some depth at tackle right now. And I'm talking on the offensive side of the ball. And there's a certain guy that played in Seattle for a few years that's still in the market named George Fant. I would love to see George Fant come back on a veteran minimum deal and play that sixth offensive lineman role that he was so good at. And then you have an experienced backup to go with Stone Forsythe. And you could play either one of those guys at both tackle spots. And so I think that offensive line depth is probably the other thing that I would point out, but defensive tackle in terms of adding a starter caliber player, that is the one spot. Who knows who's going to be available at the end of training camp? You've still got Shelby Harris out there. There are a few other veterans, but Harris would be the most logical because of his familiarity and just the talent that he would bring to the equation. There's not a lot of other veteran options out there that I think would be worth all the juggling cap-wise Seattle would have to do in order to make it happen. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. He's on the road enjoying some pre-July 4th camping, but we're glad to have him on board for the show today. And a special thanks to all the 12s, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. For everydayers, we won't be on the air tomorrow, taking a rare day off for the July 4th holiday, but we'll be back for Way Back Wednesday coming up later this week, and we'll continue our all underrated teams with linebackers and receivers. Should be a really fun episode. You won't want to miss it. We are now almost to the 20s in our 90-man countdown, numbers 35 through 31, and we wrapped up our last segment of 90-man countdowns with a special teams ace. We're going to continue this one with a special teams ace, Rob, and that being Michael Dickson. Everybody remembers the Broncos were laughing in their draft room after the Seahawks traded up to get him. And at this point, 5 years later, I think the only people that are laughing now are the punter himself. And I'm sure John Schneider can still have a little bit of chuckle, especially with the other history trading with the Broncos here the last year or so.
Yeah, exactly. I think that anytime that you draft a specialist in the third round, then you're going to get some heat. But if he winds up being a Pro Bowler and an All-Pro as a rookie, he's never missed a game. There has been some kind of comical moments at times, but I think that the biggest thing with Michael Dickson is just the sustained, consistent excellence. I mean, if you look at his this past season, Corbin, I mean, he was as good as his NFL debut, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, was he was a Pro Bowler and an All-Pro. He has not been voted to the Pro Bowl or been voted All-Pro since. But if you look at his numbers, I mean, he had a couple of years, 2020 as well as this past season, his numbers were even better than they were in his rookie year. So I think that, again, John Schneider, I think, is kind of the last one laughing right now when it comes to this selection, because that Michael Dickson continues to play at an exceptional level.
There's no such thing as a sure thing in this league, especially when we're talking about specialists. Kickers can be really erratic year to year. I've noticed that punters can be too. They are difficult jobs to do as specialists. You have limited scope of what you're supposed to do, and if you're not good at it, then that really impacts your value. But Dickson has been as consistent as any specialist in the NFL in his 5 years. Didn't have quite as high of a percentage of kicks inside the 20-yard line last year, but he still had some masterful ones where you could see the wizardry, making the ball do weird things to be down inside the 5 or 10-yard line. So he's still as good as anybody at that artistry at the punting position. Up next on our countdown here at number 34, a newcomer, but a guy that has a great chance to make the Seahawks starting lineup as a 5th-round pick, the Remington Award winner. It's interesting. We're talking about a lot of award winners here, Rob, because Michael Dickson won the Ray Guy Award at Texas before being drafted by the Seahawks as the top punter. Olu Oluwatimi was the Remington and Outland Award winner last year at Michigan, and the numbers speak for themselves. In his lone year with the Wolverines, no sacks allowed, just 9 quarterback pressures, a pass pro efficiency that was really close to 99%. Had a few penalties, but otherwise, this guy got after the run game. He was a key part of Michigan's dominant ground attack, opening up holes. He can block zone. He can block gap schemes. He can get after it as a pass protector, and he's extremely intelligent. This guy came into Michigan after playing in an air raid offense, came into a pro-style offense, and he was calling all of the plays out in run and passing. He was communicating to the line. That is not something you see centers do. This guy's well-traveled at the college level, and that is something that I think bodes well for him being able to start on day one, because he does have that experience that he can lean on as the play caller, the main communicator that a lot of your incoming centers as rookies simply cannot match.
Yeah, Corbin, all throughout the entire pre-draft process, I was kind of, just pounding the table for the Seahawks to draft a center. And the two centers I really focused in on, Joe Tippmann from Wisconsin, John Michael Schmitz from Minnesota, both of them went a little bit earlier than Olu Oluwatimi, but neither of them started as many games and did so at the highest award-winning level that Olu Oluwatimi did, as you mentioned, with his his super senior year at the University of Michigan. He was a finalist for the Remington Award when he was playing at Virginia the year before that. So he didn't have to go to a playoff team with the Michigan Wolverines and Jim Harbaugh to establish himself as one of the absolute best in college football. So that's one of the things that I love about it. I love about his game and his proven consistency. And then you touched upon the fact that he's had to do it from different schemes. He's asked to play gap assignment, gap principles, zone principles. I mean, I love Michigan asked him to block one-on-one, just pure power at times. And when this young man wants to uncoil, then he really has the power to move people. And then the quickness, and not just quickness in terms of his feet, in terms of his hands, but the quick mind. Again, his experience. That to me is why I think that this can be the rare rookie center who can come in and start for a playoff contending team. There's a lot of rookies who come in and start, but usually those teams aren't very good. That's what I was still so impressed by Seattle's willingness to start the two rookie offensive tackles and then still have a very successful offense. I think that the Seahawks are feeling very confident that Olu Oluwatimi can be up to the task. And I think that this is a really good football player who, because he doesn't have that guard center versatility, that's why he didn't get drafted as high. But still, to me, this is an example of the Seahawks recognizing they needed a little bit of a specialist. I mentioned, before with Michael Dixon, I forgot and said he was a 3rd round pick. He was a 5th round pick, of course. But just like Michael Dixon, a specialist drafted in the 5th round, I think this quote unquote specialist may wind up being a steal for the Seahawks as well.
Yeah, and he landed with a team. Andy Dickerson has already shown he will throw rookies into the fire. He will throw the young guys out there. So this is the right spot, especially for a seasoned player like Oluwatimi, who's played in multiple schemes and played at a very high level in college. Now, we've talked a lot about the defensive line, and one of the big reasons that there are so many question marks is because the only traditional nose tackle that Seattle still has on the roster without Woods being gone, that's Brian Monet, and there are question marks galore. We don't know when he is going to be back from a torn ACL. He had some other knee damage that he suffered in Week 15 against the 49ers last December, so it was suffered late in the season. A lot of times these bigger guys in the 340, 350-pound range, it takes a little more time for them to get back from these significant knee injuries. Pete Carroll made it clear at the end of mandatory minicamp that he is a long way away from being back. Now, does that mean he might miss a couple games? Does that mean he's going to miss half the season? Does that mean that his entire 2023 season is in jeopardy? We don't know the answer to any of those questions, and these things can change. They're fluid, but it would be a huge deal, figuratively and literally, if they could get this guy back early in the 2023 season so that you had an experienced veteran to go with Cameron Young, your 4th round pick, and some of the other players that are going to be rotating in, and had a true 340-pound run stuffer in the middle. I think that his health status is as big of a question mark, as big of a storyline going into the season as any for the Seahawks, even though it's probably not going to be talked about a lot because he's a run-stuffing nose tackle.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I think that's absolutely critical story to be paying attention to. I think it's a sad story because this is a good young player the Seahawks believed in, wanted to reward, and this the worst possible thing happened with an injury to a young big man. As you said, that it's going to be a length of recovery from him. And I'm sure there's some Seahawks fans out there who are wondering about, well, can't you just cut him? There are rules in place to save the players. Should they suffer a big time injury like this. So at least according to the information that I've read, Corbin, the Seahawks would really only be saving about $1.5 million if they were to release Brian Monet at this point. I think that they just view him as worth more than that. Big men who can collapse from the interior are rare, especially ones who buy into the program. The Seahawks' success with undrafted free agents speaks for itself, and Monet being a big part of that. So I think that they want to keep him around. I think that they believe in him. And as you said, with the exception of another rookie, Cameron Young, the Seahawks really don't have much beef inside. So if Brian Monet is unable to come back early on, I think you're going to continue to have all these conversations about Shelby Harris or other veterans out there. That same trickle-down effect could be suddenly stopped if Brian Monet is able to get back onto the field for the Seahawks and play effectively in 2023.
I do think that it is going to be a key to an improved run defense is having Monet's presence out there as early as possible. You don't want to rush him back, but that would be a big addition, again, figuratively and literally, to this middle of this Seahawks defensive line, getting him back. Now, another player in Seattle's defense that is working his way back from a torn ACL is linebacker Jordan Brooks. And his trajectory looks a lot better than Monet. He's posted some videos. He looks like he's moving really well. Pete Carroll has been talking about the possibility he could be ready at some point early training camp. From the discussions I've had, it's looking more and more likely that's going to be the case. He's just one of those guys that recovers really quickly. He looks good on the video that I've seen. Now, does that translate to football shape? We'll have to wait and see on that regard. But even if Jordan Brooks is able to make it back, Seattle needed to have an insurance policy on the roster, and they did that in free agency by signing Devin Bush, another former first-round pick for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And you look at the numbers last year, Rob, even though he lost his starting job late in the season, he had 83 tackles, but then the rest of the numbers didn't have the impact plays behind the line of scrimmage, no sacks, no interceptions, only one pass breakup, allowed a touchdown in coverage. The last couple of years, since he had a torn ACL himself, he just hasn't been, he's been a shell of himself. He's not been the same player making a bunch of impact plays as he was when he finished in the top 3 in Defensive Rookie of the Year balloting his first year. It looked like he was going to live up to that draft billing, but he hasn't been the same player since that injury. With that being said, we've seen the athlete that this kid is, and we've seen the playmaking ability, especially when it comes to blitzing and getting downhill, sideline to sideline speed. And I've seen enough film that suggests to me that he can play better coverage than maybe his numbers illustrate. There's still some things here that show this guy maybe could still end up being a really solid player. And it could be one of those cases where simply a change of scenery, going to a different organization, he can get his career jump-started. And that would be a big deal whether Brooks is healthy or not.
I 100% agree with you. I think that of all the players that the Seahawks signed this year, obviously Draymond Jones is going to be the one that everybody's going to get excited about, and for good reason. A very, very good player. I've always been somebody who's kind of rooting for the underdog, rooting for somebody who, people aren't talking about. And to me, that player is Devin Bush. I just still see an athlete that I believe can, if he buys in to the program, and I really think that he will with Pete Carroll, then I think that you could see the best version of Devin Bush. I think that we're seeing the best version of Geno Smith and Drew Lock. I don't think that it's coincidence that we see the best version of some of these players who have struggled a little bit early in their NFL careers, then come to Seattle and work with Pete Carroll, and suddenly they find the holy water or whatever the case might be. And I just wonder if Devin Bush isn't one of those types of players. And there's a bunch of reasons for it. For one, again, Pete Carroll. For two, the athlete that I believe Devin Bush is. Number three, I think that he was expecting, like Jordan Brooks, was expecting to get paid a little bit more in this offseason. I think that Jordan Brooks thought that he had a very good fourth year, and might get that fifth year guaranteed, and that's not going to be the case with Devin Bush. Obviously, now he has the situation in which he's got a 1-year deal. He's trying to get paid himself. I think that you're going to see that translate into some splashy plays. I think that the Seattle system is very well set up for Bush. And again, I think that this is a pretty dynamic athlete that Seattle has a need for, especially considering the types of backs, the types of tasks that a linebacker like Devin Bush might be asked to do in Seattle's system. I really think that it could translate into a big-time season for him.
Taking this countdown segment to the final stretch run, we already talked about the center race with Olu Oluwatimi. There's going to be a rookie in Anthony Bradford that is going to be part of a competition at right guard, and his main competition is the incumbent. And it's weird saying incumbent because Phil Haynes was not the starter last year at right guard, but he played a lot of snaps. The Seahawks did a rare platoon with him and Gabe Jackson. Jackson's knee was an issue. That is one of the reasons that he got cut. Also a very expensive player that, quite frankly, was not playing up to that cap number. But nonetheless, Phil Haynes was brought back on a 1-year deal. Another player that's playing for a contract this year for the Seahawks, and he's still only 27. So there's maybe still a long-term starter there. And I think that's what's fascinating about this at both center and right guards. It's not like they signed 30-plus-year-old guys that they can just plug in as short-term stopgaps. Evan Brown and Phil Haynes are both players that are still in their mid-20s. They're in the prime of their careers. And if they go out and they have a really good season, you could give them a long-term extension. That could be your starter for the next several years. with the rest of the young cogs they've got on this offensive line. And Phil Haynes certainly fits that bill if he can stay healthy. That has been the biggest issue for him, has been health. It really disrupted his first couple of years. And last year, we finally got to see flashes of what he's capable of, playing over 200 offensive snaps. Did have a few games where he struggled a bit in pass pro, but 3 games that he started, Rob, Seattle ran for almost 120 yards per game, and they went 3-0 in those games. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that was the impact that Phil Haynes had in this lineup, a guy that is a really solid run blocker and also has that basketball background at 320-plus pounds that gives him some athleticism advantages over a lot of other guards in the league. I still think there's a lot of untapped potential with this kid.
Oh, I 100% agree with you. I mean, he's only started 5 games in his NFL career to this point, and so we haven't yet seen, him really, get his opportunity. But he's got that opportunity now. I am excited about the long-term upside of Anthony Bradford. You mentioned the rookie that Seattle drafted. I think is going to be his going to be Phil Haynes' primary competition. But I think this is Phil Haynes' job. I think the Seahawks want him to be the starting right guard. I think that he is set himself up in beautiful position to seize that job and to earn himself a long-term deal, whether it be from Seattle or from someone else. I just love the combination of power and still a pretty graceful athlete. You mentioned the former basketball, playing back at Wake Forest when Seattle drafted him. So, to me, Phil Haynes is again another player that I think deserves to be ranked where we have him. I think that he is going to wind up being one of the real key cogs to Seattle's offensive line. And then one last moment, you mentioned previously about Seattle's possible need for an offensive tackle. One of the reasons why I don't know that I agree quite so much is because Bradford, as we mentioned, is the primary backup right now with Phil Haynes battling that. I like Bradford's ability to play tackle. John Schneider kind of mentioned that a couple of times unprompted during the rookie review after the draft. And I think that might be how Seattle is viewing him as well, as if they view Bradford as the kind of that swing guy that can play guard as well as tackle. So he and Stone Forsythe, I think, are basically going to be what they're looking for at that tackle spot. And that might be an area of concern for some, but I think that's the way Seattle is currently viewing things.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, signing any veteran right now is going to require the Seahawks to do some maneuvering with a very tight salary cap situation, regardless of which position they are wanting to try to upgrade early in training camp or at some point during the preseason. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. We're going to be off tomorrow. Everybody enjoy the 4th of July, but we'll be back Wednesday with Way Back Wednesday, continuing our all underrated team with linebackers and receivers. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the holiday, and thanks for listening. Go Hawks.